I enter my bigger adult years, often more and on more and more, I look back on a lot of things that happened during my teen and childhood years, and one of those things is Death Note. I remember this show was such a big deal. Everyone talked about Death Note. If you saw any kind of best animes ever made list, Death Note was on there 9 times out of 10. It was such a huge talked about anime. Mind you, this is at a time where anime was still kind of niche here in America, and it was still kind of frowned upon to like anime, especially as a black man, which is kind of like one of those things. But I remember sitting in front of the TV glued to Death Note when it first came on. And I also remember not realizing that, like, that whole show was a masterpiece. At the time, I liked it and I was very invested, but I wasn't completely able to comprehend the entire series at the time. But I just remember Death Note, like everyone, the mangas, the books, people were just like ready to like be L for Halloween. L was such a popular anime character, might have been the most popular anime character at that time. Like L and all that stuff was such a big deal. And like turning 20 is like a major perspective because it really became like one of the gateway anime series for an entire generation of people. That was like a lot of people's first like really big, complicated, serious one. Because like we had all seen like Sailor Moon and Inuyasha and Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh and stuff like that. But Death Note was like, whew, Death Note was a big deal at the time. And when Death Note premiered back in 2006, it introduced anime audiences to one of the most iconic psychological battles between Light and L. And 20 years later, the series remains incredibly recognizable, endlessly debated, and remarkably accessible to people who don't normally watch anime. And based on the manga by Sugumi Amba, I'm pretty sure I said that person's name wrong, and illustrated by Takeshi Obata, Death Note begins with one of the most ridiculously compelling ideas. In what if you could kill anyone simply by writing their name in a notebook? I thought it was kind of dumb when I was a kid. I was like, yeah, you just write their name in the book and they just straight up off the person. Cool, but kind of goofy. But also, I was like, you know what? I kind of need this book. But anyway, and then it asked a more interesting question. What would that power eventually do to you? And like Yagami, the hero slash villain, or even something worse of the series, begins as an extraordinarily intelligent student who discovers Death Note after the Shinigami Ryuk drops it into the human world. Initially, Light convinces himself that he's doing something righteous. He only kills criminals. He's reducing crime. He's creating a better world. Become basically a god. And that's where Death Note becomes kind of fascinating because, like, this random teenage kid who's going off to college gets the power to wipe out anyone by writing a name. And then, not only that, he comes up with all these incredibly clever ways to make it seem like he's doing the right thing. Like, obviously, he's wiping out a bunch of criminals, and then he's wiping out just peers. But eventually, the power starts to corrupt him. He's the most gifted kid in Japan at this point. He is very smart, very well talked about, very well established, going to one of the best, if not the best college in Tokyo, has this power. And the series isn't really asking whether criminals should face consequences. It's examining what happens when one individual gives himself absolute authority to determine who deserves to live, and like gradually stops eliminating only dangerous criminals. People investigating him become targets, people who threaten his plans become disposable, friends become tools, relationships become strategies, and the notebook doesn't necessarily transform Light into something else. It gradually reveals just how far he's willing to go when nobody can stop him. And Light was so compelling to me. I know a lot of people make fun of Brad Swale. I know the potato chip and eat it and all that stuff. But all in all, Brad Swale is actually a damn good voice actor, and he does a really good job of bringing Light's sadistic, very slimy side to life. He does a great job. Like I remember, what was her name? Naomi Misura. That was my favorite character for no reason. I was like, there's no way she's going to live past this episode because she would solve the whole thing. And she basically does. But when she still gets off by him, you really want to punch him in the face. You really want to beat the crap out of Light. But at the same time, you're like, she was not going to solve this case. She was not going to solve this case. And then what was the other, it became a point where he was like offing people and like gloating about it, and it turns pretty quickly. I think Naomi Misura dies like, oh, episode 6, episode 7, but she had offed Ray Penber by that point and like laughed at him while he was the train door was closing. He killed Naomi Misura off the, like, my man Light was wiping people off the face of the planet. Like, this nigga didn't care. This nigga was ruthless, bro. And it was crazy how he was going through great lengths to not get caught. Light as a character is so interesting because like he's a pretentious douchebag, but you still kind of like him and you kind of want him to win, but you really, really want L to win. And I think it's like, man, which one do I like more? Do I like Light more? Obviously, over the years, it's still L. Right? I still love L to death. He's like so awesome. But at the time when I first saw Death Note, I was like, either one of you bastards could win, and I'd be so happy. Like, bruh. And Light is so compelling in how he uses people around him, uses the world around him to sneak away, to get away. One of the best written decisions that I think in the show to happen was he erased his own memory so that he wouldn't get caught, and then finds a Death Note, touches it, and all of his memories came back. I thought that was one of the coolest parts of the entire series. Now, I'm going to leave Light alone for a little bit because I got to get into the big star of the show, and it's all about L. This is really like the heart of the show, Light versus L. L doesn't have any supernatural powers. He has his brain, and watching these two geniuses attempt to outmaneuver one another remains incredible. Light needs L's real name. L needs to prove that Light is Kira. Neither can make an obvious move. So conversations become battles. A seemingly meaningless action becomes evidence. Eating potato chips becomes suspenseful. The show somehow, thus, thinking into action. That's extraordinarily difficult to accomplish. And that's one of the big hearts of the show. I remember when L first came onto the scene, I thought this nigga was a ghost with black hair. And he's just sitting on the chair. He's so weird and so in truth, but he's so smart and he's controlling the room and he's just there with it, man. He's just there with it. And I believe L is supposed to be about 24, I think. And I thought Alessandro Giuliani was perfect. Nobody can sit here and say Alessandro Giuliani wasn't perfect as L. He is still to this day regarded as one of the best castings in anime because he nails it. It's like nobody else can be L in my opinion, and that sounds a little pretentious, but like I genuinely feel that way. Like, I don't think anybody else can be L. And L has this whole thing of like, I know justice. I'm gonna bring you down. I just have to prove it. I know you're guilty. I know who you are, but I have to prove it. And going through all the frustrating things for L, my man went through so much crap. He had to deal with Light, then he ended up having to deal with Misa, he had to deal with Ryuk, and he didn't count on Rem. And he went through hell when that whole situation went down. I was like, oh God. I feel so bad for L because he has it like right there. He has it. He knows it. He knows what it is. He just has to prove it. And that's kind of the ultimate problem as to what happens. L has some great moments. That fight with him and Light in the apartment room, love that. Shows L's actually tougher than he looks. The scene where he like presumably touches Misa's butt to steal her cell phone, because Misa saw his name, so Misa knows his name, which is like a very scary moment for me. Still to this day, 'cause it's like, bruh, she knew his name and everything, but they arrested her. They sealed her eyes closed, sealed her mouth shut, or no, they kept her mouth active so that she couldn't. It was, bruh, that whole sequence is kind of rough to watch, even as an adult. It was rough to watch when I first saw it. It was even rougher to watch as an adult. Uh, what else goes on for L? Like pretty much everything. He's the best detective in the world. He's so smart, so controlling, so well calm. He never really breaks character. Some of his funniest moments is pissing off Light because he knows that Light is Kira. And I think my favorite scene in the entire series is when they're sitting at the college entrance ceremony, and he says, "I want to tell you, I'm Al," and Light freaks out. And that is my favorite scene in the show, believe it or not. I think that scene was so clutch that L pissed Light off at that point. And when I mentioned someone earlier, I had to mention this nigga Ryuk. This man Ryuk, he's not really Light's partner. He is watching because he genuinely just is intrigued about the outcome of what's going to happen. He dropped the Death Note because he was bored. Like, and human beings subsequently create this enormous international conflict around the notebook, while Ryuk basically just sits back and is like, "F it, bro. I'm about to see how this goes down," and that makes his relationship with Light particularly interesting. It really does because Ryuk tells him from the beginning that he isn't there to save him, and ultimately that matters. And Ryuk really doesn't give a damn. And I want to go into Misa. Like Ryuk doesn't get that much to like really talk about, but he has a great character. But then there's Misa Mane. In my opinion, the worst character in the show. I can't stand Misa. I think she's annoying. I think she was just sadly a puppet by choice. And Rem irritates me because Rem is the reason why L doesn't win. Right? Like Rem ends up getting feelings for Misa, cares about her enough to the point where she offs L, and L couldn't account for Rem being involved because that's really why L loses, is because a second Shinigami is involved that he didn't know about. And that's pretty much the origin of those two. Like that's pretty much it. Like I don't really have a lot to say about Misa and Rem because I don't really like either character that much. And the question that made Death Note explode. This is the key thing. It's like the brilliance of the series is that audiences immediately started debating the premise: was Kira right? That is still debated all the way to this day in 2026. Was Kira right? And it's kind of interesting because, the ending ends with like getting shot and he dies. And the whole Kira case is put behind us forever. But as soon as he is dead, crime goes back up. So it's kind of like, did we off the one thing that was keeping crime in check, or at least down? We don't know. And if you could eliminate the murders and violent criminals, and crime subsequently dropped, will society actually be better? What happens when innocent people become obstacles? Who determines guilt? What happens when the person making those decisions becomes corrupted? Well, all those things are here in Death Note. And Death Note forces audiences to confront the difference between justice and power. And Light genuinely thought he was emitting his own form of justice. And he stood 10 toes down on it. He never once bailed. And it did give him the power to kind of do what he needed to do if he thought at first it was the right thing to do. Which even some villains, a lot of villains tend to do that. And 20 years later, people still really argue about it. It's really crazy. Go on some Reddit pages, go on some forum pages, anime pages. You will see people still to this day arguing, was Kira really right about his ways of going about it? And that's the sign of an effective story. If people are still fighting over Death Note 20 years later about who was right and who was wrong, that tells you that Death Note was a definite big deal back in the day. And also, I'll say it was a pop culture phenomenon. Everyone was talking about Death Note in the anime community. Hell, a lot of people was like, "Yo, I started watching this thing called Death Note. Crazy." I was like, "Dang, you ain't never seen Death Note?" Like, that's really how it was. because it genuinely was one of the best animes of its time. And I still think Death Note's a great anime to this day on a rewatch. I personally don't put Death Note in my top 10, but I do remember it, why it was so popular, though, because it was a huge deal. Huge deal. And this is like another major part of perspective because during the 2000s, anime really was rapidly becoming a lot more mainstream internationally. Death Note became one of those shows people recommended to someone who didn't watch anime, and it was on Adult Swim. So if you had cable, you could just put on Adult Swim on Saturday, you'll see an episode of Death Note, and you didn't really need any extensive knowledge of Japanese culture, like say Urusei Yatsura. Like if you look at Urusei Yatsura in 2026, there's so many pop culture references no one would get because it came out in the 70s and 80s. Like like Urusei Yatsura, you have to know at least some form of Japanese culture to get some of the jokes. That's why I couldn't really get into it. And you really didn't need to understand complicated power systems. You didn't need to watch hundreds of episodes. It was 37 episodes, and with an immediately understandable premise. 37 episodes, man, it's cake. It's cake. And once someone watched the first episode, I'll take a potato chip and eat it. Eventually, it was waiting for him around the corner. That scene, his it was so big. Everyone made fun of that because it was hilarious. It was a hilariously written line, hilariously delivered line. Yeah, and well, okay, I can't talk about that. I'm talking about that second half, right? That controversial second half. What happens after L dies? I will say that Silence is my favorite episode of the show. It is the point of the series where I've stopped watching multiple times because I don't think Death Note quite feels as great as it did before that episode. You know what I mean? Like once silence happens, that's the end of the show for me. You know, and there's a whole actual ending that I do know. I've watched it a few times and it's a very downer ending actually, which makes sense for a show of this tone. It makes sense that the ending is such a downer. And for many fans, the Light L rivalry represents the absolute peak of the show, and the introduction of Near and Mellow takes the story in a different direction. And like 20 years later, whether the series maintains its quality after L remains one of the biggest debates as well. And that's perfect. Like, did Death Note peak too early? Please let me know down below. Do y'all really think Death Note peaked too early, or was the second half necessary to complete Light's story? Let me know how y'all feel down below about that. Because I personally think I don't think it peaked too early. I just think it lost its peak once L dies. And getting into the ending, whatever people think about the later episodes, Light's downfall completes the central idea pretty darn well. A young man finds the power to decide who lives and dies. He convinces himself he's creating justice. Eventually, he believes he is justice. And ultimately, the same supernatural system that gave him the power is what destroys him. That's something almost Shakespearean, which is pretty crazy. And also, I do gotta say a shout out to Light's dad. I do think Light's dad is probably the most purely moral character in the entire show. And I do feel bad for Light's dad at the end of the show because Light's dead. I think his daughter's I think Light's sister's like in a wheelchair at the end. It's just a very you feel really bad for Light's dad. You know what I mean? And I will say, 20 years later, the animation has aged, technology has aged, has changed, anime has become vastly more mainstream, but Death Note's central question hasn't aged at all. If you possessed absolute power over life and death, what would you do with it? And perhaps more importantly, how long would it take before you convinced yourself that whatever you were doing was justified? That's why Death Note remains relevant all these years later. It's a supernatural thriller, detective story, psychological battle, morality play, and one of the most important gateway anime series of the 2000s. And that is how I feel about Death Note. I think that it's still aged pretty well, in my opinion. I think it still looks really good. That opening theme song, the first one, then that really crazy second one that people make fun of a lot. But Death Note is Death Note, bro. Like, it is what it is. You can even get a Death Note on Amazon at this point. So take that for what you want to know, bro. But that's been my review. Let me know how you guys feel about Death Note down below. Do you remember Death Note from 20 years ago? Did you come into it years later? Let me know how you feel down below. Like, comment, and subscribe for more. I will see you on